Good evening. I've got more than 30 minutes, so if I'm late, it's entirely my fault. So hopefully we will let you out on time tonight. I apologize in advance. Tyler isn't speaking tonight. Over the last couple of weeks, we've gotten used to him, and it's been a wonderful experience. I'm afraid tonight that the title of our lesson may ring true from a speaking standpoint when comparing myself to Tyler, walking with God in the desert being probably me, and Tyler probably being the land flowing with milk and honey. So hopefully it won't be too painful. The thing we'll be able to learn tonight is that God teaches us things even when we're in the desert. So if you're not in a desert place tonight, maybe you will be just sitting in the pew. Maybe that's how you'll identify with the lesson, but hopefully not tonight. Ken brought us a series about good things that can happen after being in stressful situations. And it reminded me of some of the thoughts I'd heard on living with God and walking with God in the desert previously. And so I started preparing a lesson for that, and I thought I would do it for the ladies' class, but changed my topic for that, but decided to do that when Ken, do this lesson when Ken asked me to do that a couple of weeks ago. And I think we've had a lot of lessons, including the lesson yesterday at the ladies' luncheon, around how God teaches people and what we can learn when we go through trials. And this lesson will be akin to that and to the lessons that Ken taught us, but I think it will be a little bit different, and it'll have a little bit different twist to it. So hopefully you can indulge me with that. So tonight I wanted to show you some pictures of some deserts, and so we can get kind of a feel for what that might be. And so I want you to remember several things as we go through this. So the first thing is deserts are beautiful, okay? And you'll see that through some of these pictures. Remember that as we look at some of these photos. Here's a picture of the Sinai Desert, the Desert of Shur, the Negev, the Desert of Sin, and the Desert of Zin, the Judean wilderness, which is right there just east of where it says Hebron. You'll see it says Judea Mountains and then Judea Wilderness. You may or may not be able to see that with the naked eye, but it's right there close to the Dead Sea. And then there's lots of different names of the desert. But if you look at this photo, which says the Exodus route, that's debatable, so we're not going to talk about that tonight. But what you will see is a lot of brown, dead wasteland, okay? Not much going on here in the way of foliage. And so you'll see that it's somewhat mountainous there in the South Sinai region, and there even over in Paran and other places south of Judea. And a lot of people think that is Mount Sinai. We're going to read several passages or talk about several instances when people went into the desert. And one of them is when Elijah went into the desert, the Judean wilderness, but then he traveled 40 days to Mount Hebor, Mount of the Lord, which is also considered to be Mount Sinai. And so it's quite a ways away, believed to be south, either in the Sinai area or there where it shows on this map as well. So looking at the desert, here's the desert of Paran. So you'll remember seeing that on the previous map. Kind of pretty, but not much going on. This is more in the wilderness in Paran. Think about at night being all alone in the dark in this place. Probably wouldn't seem that beautiful to you at that point. Here's some of the canyons and the mountainous areas. Again, very beautiful, but not really any signs of real life. This is in the Timnah region. It's called Solomon's Pillars in the Timnah Valley. Notice the trees in the photo here. We'll come back to talking about some trees in a moment. But that's about as fruitful as the desert gets in most places. Here's one of the bushes. So if you come across a bush, it's a rarity, and there's the bush. When you come to it, a common bush in this Timnah region area. I would probably run over that with a lawnmower if it were in my yard or in my landscaping. Here's another one, a little bit bushier. Again, very beautiful, but think about during the day, the heat and no shade and no water source. And think about how long you could last, much less the children of Israel, maybe 1 million plus people walking through the desert. The desert of Zin, you get to see some of the mountains. This is what's called a wadi, which is kind of an area between mountains where water, when it rains, comes down from some other source and comes down through the desert. And some think this could be what Jesus was referring to in Matthew 6 when he says, do not build, the foolish man built his house on the sand. And the sand being there in the wadi in the lower level, and then the rocks being up above. And so what happens is flash floods happen in the desert, and water comes rushing down and can take anything that's in its path down. So obviously, a lot of the times, and you'll see some other pictures, this would be dry, completely dry. But it has just had kind of a flash flood come through. And so it has water here. This is another one of those such canyons and wadis in the bottom. This kind of looks like maybe the road kind of looks the same type of a road that going to Jericho from Jerusalem. You see the vastness. And here's the Judean wilderness. Doesn't seem very big on the map, but as you can see, it's pretty substantial. And you can see a few of the cities here and there, but there is a lot of wilderness in between. Not much vegetation. And this is probably the same wilderness that Jesus went to when he was tempted in Matthew 4. Again, here's some rocks that you might run into in the wilderness, hard to get over. We'll talk about those in a little bit. They might actually provide something periodically, so we'll look at that in a minute. And then if you can see in the lower portion of this picture, says the Wadi Kilt, Jericho and Rift. So you can see Jericho over to the right. And probably this is most likely the road leading from the Jerusalem area down to Jericho. And so forms a wadi there and lots of caves and all kinds of different things through there. But again, not much, but maybe bugs, scorpions, snakes might find that here in the wilderness. And then you probably are also going to find dirt and sand, and don't forget the dust and the dust storms and the sand storms that are possible. And if you're the children of Israel, after you think about the bugs and the scorpions and the dark and the heat and the lack of water and the lack of shade and the sands and the dirt, think about that times 40 years. A lot of us have watched these reality shows where it's man against wild, and they're going to go in the desert, but they don't go into the desert for 40 years. But that's what God asked of his people. So I think God teaches certain things through the desert, but we kind of have to understand what the desert brings in order to understand really what he teaches. The desert is a place of peril. It's a place of danger. It's a place of chaos, of pain and suffering, an unquenchable thirst, of weariness, of struggles. If you don't have beef jerky and a bunch of bread, then you're going to run out. And even if you do, you're going to run out fairly quickly, and you're going to have the hunger set in along with all of these other things. So it's definitely a place of peril. But because it's a place of peril, it also provides some things that maybe might help some. So it's a place of refuge and protection. So if no one wants to go there, then that's the best place to go if you're hiding from someone, right? Just like when you're playing hide and go seek, you're probably going to win if you choose a place where no one really wants to go, right? Or a place with spiders, or a place in the attic in the dark, or a place that's very uncomfortable, right, kids? That's the best hiding place. And so the desert is a place of refuge and protection. You remember Moses ran from Pharaoh and hid from Pharaoh in the desert. David, remember who David was fleeing from in 1 Samuel 23, fleeing and hiding from Saul. And then Elijah, in 1 Kings 19, was fleeing from Jezebel and went into the wilderness, the Judean wilderness, and took shade up under a juniper tree, if you remember that. And we saw a couple of those little trees that he might have gotten shade from there in the wilderness. The desert is also a place of provision. So remember, Elijah was fed by the ravens in the desert. But God also, here in 1 Kings 19, fed him, and then this is where he ran to Mount Hebor, and for 40 days did not have to eat because God provided for him in the desert. It's also the same instance where Elijah was able to see God, or God passed in front of the mountain. Israel had provision. If you remember in Exodus 15, not only was there manna and was there quail, but in Exodus 15 he turned the waters that were bitter at Marah, which means bitter, to sweet. And so God knows how to provide in the desert, and the desert is a place where sometimes only God can provide. Only God can provide things like manna. Only God can provide things like water. And only God can provide sometimes the shade just enough for when it's needed. So I believe that God really knew what he was doing by bringing his children into the wilderness, into the desert, because he wanted to teach them things. It wasn't on accident. He wanted them to rely upon him. And I would say tonight that we want to learn to do the same, and he wants us to learn to do the same. So God took Israel to the desert to develop a relationship with him. Psalm 78:52, he led forth his own people like sheep as a guide and guided them into the wilderness like a flock. And in Deuteronomy 32:10, he found him in a desert land, and in the howling waste of the wilderness, he encircled him. He cared for him. He kept him as the apple of his eye. So this is what God does when we're in the desert, or when his people are in the desert. He's able to build a relationship with his people or with us. God takes us to the desert, and took his people to the desert so that they might learn dependence. He wanted to teach them dependence. In Deuteronomy 8:2-3, you shall remember the whole way of the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. He humbled you and let you hunger, and fed you manna which you did not know, nor did your father know. And he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of God. And so he teaches us dependence, and that's what Jesus was teaching Satan there in Matthew 4 in the desert. It quotes the same exact verse in Deuteronomy 8:3. And then God continued throughout the Old Testament to take his people to the desert and to use the desert as a metaphor to teach his people things. He says in Ezekiel 19:10-11 and 13-14, your mother was like a vine in your garden, in your vineyard, planted by the water. It was fruitful and full of branches because of the abundant water. Its branches were strong, fit for a ruler's scepter. And so he said, hey, I took you out of that desert, brought you to the promised land, and this is how it was. But now I'm going to use the desert again to teach you. Now it is planted in the desert, in a dry and thirsty land. Fire spread from one of its main branches and consumed its fruit. No strong branches left on it, fit for a ruler's scepter. And then again, Ezekiel 20 says, I will bring you into the wilderness of the nations there, face to face. I will plead you, as I pleaded with the ancestors in the wilderness of the land of Egypt. So I will plead with you, declares the sovereign Lord. I will take note of you as you pass under my rod, and I will bring you into the bond of the covenant. So he uses these metaphors of the desert to say, hey, I'm going to teach you something. And they were very acquainted with the desert. Desert was all around the land flowing with milk and honey, and the promised land. They were very acquainted with the desert. And so these were teaching moments that he took to say, hey, this is what you are like when you are away from me. You're in a wasteland, in a desert, without help, and removed from the springs of life and from the water. So for us, what's the practical application? Do we have deserts in our life? Let's look at what deserts can mean from a spiritual application. Tyler this morning talked about the physical versus the spiritual, and being tall physically versus being spiritually mature. And so this is the same type of thought here. Let's look at what the deserts can speak to us from a spiritual sense, how they can speak to us. They can be a place or a period of time. Okay, so when times are tough, that can be a desert for us. When things are not the way they are supposed to be, that can be a time of desert for us. And maybe we're being tested, or maybe we're just being asked to change something. Things aren't the way they're supposed to be, and we don't like change. I think God wants us to rely on him, though, and no matter the circumstance, he wants us to put our faith and our trust in him, even when we're asked for things to be as they to change, or to be as they different from the way they used to be. Here's some examples from Jesus' ministry. Some of the people that had a desert in their life of some sort. The woman bleeding for 12 years. The leper. A child born with a demon, or a man born blind. You can remember these people had lived their whole life begging, their whole life blind. Woman to be stoned. And a widow with a dead son. All of these are desert times in people's lives. We could go on and on with these examples, but I think many of us can relate to some of these examples, can think of times in our life when we've been in a desert. If we're human, I think we definitely can identify at some point where we've been emotionally, mentally, or in a spiritual desert. So when God takes us there to the desert, it isn't by accident, I don't think, just like it went for his people, the Israelites, as they were wandering. Remember, he teaches us things in the desert. So what does he teach us? Why does he take us sometimes to the place of a desert? I think I'm going to actually give you a couple of more examples here before I take you to the next slide. So these are some of the ways that God can take us into a desert, or that we can just become in a desert from a application standpoint. Critical illness, loss of a loved one, handicap or disability for yourself or someone you love, the loss of a job, the rejection, persecution. Rejection's a big one. No one likes to be rejected because we think that you're rejecting us and the flesh as a person. We forget that God's the one in control, and if we're living for him, he's the one that's being rejected. Financial property or loss. Mental illness for someone you love. So God does take us to these deserts. What does he teach us when he takes us to deserts like this? He encourages us to depend on him rather than on ourselves. So he builds here dependence, and the desert is a place where only he provides. We don't like to be dependent because we're fleshly people and we want to be strong and do it ourselves. But God says, no, I'm going to use the desert to teach you how to rely on me. Hosea 13:5, I cared for you in the desert, in the land of burning heat. He takes us to the desert in order to develop a relationship with us. All too often, we want things. We want to have a relationship with the world, and we don't want to have a relationship with God, but he wants to teach us to be his people, and he uses the desert to do that. Isaiah 49:10, they will neither hunger nor thirst, nor will the desert heat or the sun beat down on them. He who has compassion on them will guide them and lead them besides springs of water. So God loves us, and he wants what's best for us. And then finally, God takes us to the desert to protect us from the love of the world and the things of the world. And we are reminded in Proverbs 3:5-6, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. And so he wants us to learn while we're in the desert to have trust in him. He wants it to build our trust. So I wanted to look at a couple of metaphors tonight that God teaches us in the desert. God provides shade in the desert. He keeps it bearable. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at the right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and going both now and forever. So if we look at the shade, we're reminded of a couple of metaphors in the desert. One is the acacia tree, and that's just what that looks like. And so you can see that the acacia tree reminds us that God can be our shade even in the desert. It's not much, but if you've been walking all day and you're beat down in the sun, maybe that's all you need to be able to survive is a little bit of shade. And we read there in 1 Kings 19 that Isaiah found a tree to lie up under. And so maybe that's something like what he laid up under. The broom tree also gives us an example, and it is more about, hey, he's giving us what we need just for the moment. And you'll see what I'm talking about here. So this is the broom tree. Kind of looks like a broom if you turned it upside down. But you can see it just provides just a little bit of shade. And I would say probably as the day progresses, you're going to have to move a little bit to stay in that shade. But it's pretty neat how God can provide just enough for what we need. And sometimes in our life, I think that's what's going on. We don't think we can take it anymore, but he gives us just enough encouragement, just enough strength to continue to make it bearable. So let's look at a couple of metaphors from Psalms 23. He gives us green pastures. And some people might think of green pastures as lush green grass, but for desert people, that may or may not be the fact. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. But in the desert, those green pastures might be just enough for the moment. Here are the sheep grazing in the green pastures of the desert. And as you can see, there aren't really any green pastures here as we would think of them. But what you'll find is the Lord provides water and dew upon the rocks, and grass springs up in the morning and is gone by the afternoon. But it's just enough for those sheep, and those shepherds know where those rocks are and how it hits, how the sun hits and how the water hits, and they go to those pastures in the desert. Here's some sheep grazing in the desert. Not many what I would consider green pastures, but they're being provided for. And here's something that's more like maybe a green pasture, but still a lot of rock. But those sheep will come in and devour all of that, and then it will grow back quickly in the desert. God also, from Psalms 23, will provide. He's the good shepherd that provides quiet waters. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the paths for his name's sake. So remember that wadi that we looked at earlier. This is another one where waters can come through gushing and be a danger for the sheep. And they're not quiet waters. They're rushing waters. And it may be just for a moment where there hasn't been water in months. And so the good shepherd knows where those are and keeps the sheep away from them, just like God does for us in the desert. And here's a picture of quiet water in the desert. You see, no matter the oppression or desert that we are all in, the Lord wants us to know that he satisfies. And Nathan read for us Psalm 63, 1 through 5. O Lord, you are my God. I shall seek you earnestly. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh yearns for you in a dry and weary land where there is no water. And it goes on to talk about there David is in the wilderness fleeing. And he's talking about the desert and how his soul would rather seek the Lord than to seek water or to seek food. And so we need to learn that the Lord satisfies, whether in the desert or in plenty. But we sometimes forget when we're in plenty that it's the Lord that's giving it to us. And so if we forget the Lord and that He's the one that satisfies, we may find ourselves back in the desert to learn again that we need to rely always upon the Lord and have that relationship and that dependence upon Him. Isaiah 59, it actually says, I believe, may have skipped it, or I may not have it. Isaiah 58, 9 through 11 also reminds us of how the Lord is kind to us in the desert and when we seek Him. So as we close this evening, I propose that whether we have been relying, depending, or trusting on God to supply our needs or not, we have all been in the desert at one time or another. If you have been walking with God in a desert, you might look okay or even good on the outside, but I assure you on the inside, you are dry and probably full of poison if you haven't been relying upon God and He hasn't been supplying your needs. However, instead, if you have had a relationship with the Lord and relied on Him for every need, you may look rough. Some of us may look rough on the outside, but on the inside, you're watered, you're fed, you have good fruit, because that's what He has promised to us. You see, the Lord says there are two types of trees, Jeremiah 17, 5 through 8. Cursed is the one who trusts in man, who draws strength from mere flesh, and whose heart turns away from the Lord. That person will be like a bush, an aurora tree in the wastelands. They will not see prosperity when it comes. They will dwell in parched places of the desert, in a salt land where no one lives. But blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in Him. They will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream. It does not fear when heat comes. Its leaves are always green. It has no worries in a year of drought and never fails to bear fruit. So tonight, what kind of tree are you? Are you the aurora tree? If you can imagine, if you came upon this tree in the desert, you would think, hey, I have found the jackpot. It's got lush fruit on it. It looks green and vivacious. But the problem is, when you open the fruit, it goes poof. And there's nothing there but dryness and dust. And if you try to eat the fruit, you will die because it's poisonous. And so we don't want to be like the aurora tree that may look good on the outside from a fleshly perspective, but we want to be like the stream by the water that's fed from God and that never thirsts and that produces good fruit. And so there's that stream by the quiet water. You can see it's kind of twisted a little bit, the trunk. And so maybe the outside may not look that great, but that tree will last the test of time, and it won't worry about the sun or the scorching heat. So I ask you tonight, which tree do you want to be? Hopefully you want to be the tree fed by the streams of water. And so I hope tonight this lesson has helped you understand and learn some things that maybe the desert teaches us about reliance upon God, about putting our faith in Him, about depending on Him and having a relationship with Him. So as we extend the invitation, maybe tonight you just need prayers because you need to get through a particular desert in your life. Maybe you've lived spiritually in the desert. And it could be that you've lived the last 40 years like the Israelites did in a desert. And maybe you haven't been relying upon God. Maybe tonight you need to learn to rely on Him. put your faith in Him, trust in Him by confessing His name, by repenting of your sin, by being baptized through faith. Or maybe you need to remember that there is a promised land on the other side of repentance. Whatever your need is, we'd encourage you to come as we stand and sing together.